So, hello and welcome to the Reason for Living podcast. I'm joined today by Sam Russell. He's a guitarist, composer, and author specializing in rock, metal, and classical music. And he's the author of How to Practice Guitar and Train Your Creativity. Sam, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, I know you're currently running a crowdfunding campaign to record what you describe as beautiful melodic string quartets in a lyrical romantic style. Why do you think this is an important kind of music to create, and why do you think people would want to fund creating it or listen to it? Why do you think people should listen to it?
Well, I think you can't have there's no such thing as having too much beauty in your life. So being able to have some beautiful music is always going to make life a little bit better. And I guess there's a kind of a deeper perspective to that in general with why should we have beautiful music. I think music is quite unique in what it does is it's a way to communicate emotions, which emotions are a bit like colours. You can't describe colour to a blind man. Music gives you a way to describe emotion to somebody in a way that they can immediately feel it. So I could say to you what being sad feels like. I could describe it with words, but unless you've ever actually felt that emotion yourself, you're going to say, okay, that sounds like a nice description or something I don't want to experience. But you're not really going to know what it is until you actually experience the emotion yourself. And music gives you a way to communicate emotions, which is quite unique. I don't think anything else lets you do that quite that way.
So there's two kinds of music, essentially. There's lyrical music and instrumental music. And with lyrical music, you can express complicated ideas through the words themselves and back that up with instrumental accompaniment that hopefully matches the emotional tone of what's being sung. But with something like a string quartet, with something that's just purely instrumental, how much do you think that can express complex ideas or a particular view of the world rather than just raw emotions like happiness or anger?
I don't think you could communicate a specific idea with instrumental music. So instrumental music, I think it can only communicate emotion, and it could communicate a sense of life as well. Interesting question. So, for example, Megadeth released an album where Dave Mustaine wrote some lyrics about, I think it was the Large Hadron Collider, or a similar experiment that was taking place somewhere in the world. And you couldn't communicate an idea about cutting-edge particle physics with instrumental music, unless you had some sort of very, very, what's the kind of way to describe it, geeky approach where you laid the notes out in a specific mathematical formula to represent some sort of physics thing. But even then, the music's not representing the idea as much as how it's being constructed on the page. So I think you can only describe emotions and a sense of life with music. And with the sense of life, it depends how the music's been put together. Sad music doesn't necessarily mean you're expressing a nihilistic sense of life, for example, or a hopeless sense of life. I think that sometimes people think that music that expresses a positive sense of life should always be happy. If that was the case, we'd be listening to ragtime music all the time, which would be dreadful. Even if you have the greatest sense of life in the world, you're going to experience negativity at some point in your life, and music gives you a way to communicate that, to express that, to feel that, to identify with it. So music gives you a way to do that. There is some music is just absolutely awful and does communicate a negative sense of life, and that's when it's just either very negative or very atonal all the time. And you get that with lots of contemporary classical music, kind of niche black metal bands do things like that as well, and just bad, depressing music overall.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of the heavy metal musicians or dark metal musicians that I follow have a really positive sense of life outside of that music. A good example is the band Death Stars. They're an industrial metal band from the Netherlands. Their music is very gloomy, it's got screaming, it's got low vocals, downtuned guitars, very chuggy, all that kind of doomy sound. And a lot of very sort of what sound like negative themes in their music as well. A lot of stuff about death and apocalypse and that kind of stuff. But whenever I watch the behind the scenes stuff about them making their albums, they're just joking, smiling all the time. They have a very positive sense of life. So do you think there's a lethargic dimension to that kind of music, that it's letting out people's negativity so that they can enjoy life the rest of the time? Or is there something positive about that kind of music as well?
I think it would probably be the former. There's definitely something to music like that being used as a way for people to let off steam, I guess, or a way to express their emotions. The guys in that band seem to be quite good at what they do, and they're just having a great time doing it. So that's great for them. And if everyone generally enjoys it as well, then that's great as well.
And there's also the virtuosity, isn't it? There's appreciating skill and human beings producing something with skill, whether that's technical guitar playing or production, composition. The more I've learned about being a guitarist and being a musician, the more I've come to appreciate in even what sound like relatively simple songs, the level of skill that actually goes into producing those, which I think is part of the problem with a lot of modern music that doesn't require as much skill is you can't appreciate the human mind at work in the same way listening to it. You mentioned on your fundraiser that modern classical music is, I think you said, dissonant, difficult, and frankly awful. Can you talk a bit more about why that is? What you think's gone wrong, both with modern classical music and perhaps with modern popular music as well?
There's I think there's a variety of, or a couple of big factors at play. One is there's probably something to do with how it's being taught at universities. I don't know exactly how it's being taught because I haven't studied music at university myself. But when I've been studying university grade textbooks in my own time just for fun to get better at what I do, and talking to people online that have been looking at these books as well, they've mentioned that, for example, a 600-page book on the structural form in music called sonata form is something that university lecturers and composition will spend a couple of months going through, which you can't go through something that deep in a couple of months. It'd be a couple of years of practicing. Well, just to get through the book would take a year, and then practicing writing in the form would take a couple of years as well. So one problem is probably that not enough time is being given to students to look at these topics in depth. Another is the grant processes. I don't know how it is in the rest of the world, but in the UK, if you look at the projects being funded by the Arts Council and by music grants, I'm always astounded and actually incredibly depressed whenever I hear what's been recorded by them, just completely random noise. But if that's what's getting the money, then that's what people are going to do. To some extent, why wouldn't you? So there's a couple of big factors at play there. I think another is that people don't appreciate how much effort it takes to get good at something. They misidentify struggling with the process with not being intrinsically capable of seeing the process through to the end. Or to put it maybe another way, they think it should be easier than it is, and because they're struggling with it, I say struggling because they're not struggling, that's just the normal learning process. They think they're not capable of it at all. Whereas if they just kept going, kept working at it, they would eventually get better and be capable of doing it. I think most people, on average, most people being inside the normal distribution, are capable of doing quite great things. They just stick at it for a very long time.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that about the level of practice required, but I also want to focus in on what you said about university, because I did music at the study of music, like musicology, at Oxford Brookes University.
Oh, right.
At master's level. And I saw this academic clique. I saw it when I went to De Montfort. I did half a PhD there as well. And I saw this academic clique who live in this sort of almost government-funded bubble of research into what they call avant-garde electroacoustic music, or deconstructive, progressive, all these other terms that are used that describe compositions where somebody let a cat walk across the room and chose which note to write next based on which part of the room the cat ended up in and things like that. And philosophically, like, what do you think's behind that tendency of academic musicians or leaders in music research, in music education, to reject what most people like, reject harmony, reject structure, reject anything popular, and instead go towards this sort of indulgent research into something that nobody in their right mind would actually enjoy, but which is almost a source of purpose for a lot of these researchers? Why do you think that's happened?
I think these people don't have a soul. It's my main conclusion. What drives somebody to want to do that? I don't know. It could be that tempting to do something that, or maybe they feel like if they were to go a more tonal route with music, they'd be trying to live up to Beethoven and Rachmaninoff, and maybe that's a daunting thing. I don't think that's the right way to think about it, though I can understand if people would think about that and would be put off by it. I frequently see people commenting on videos of 9-year-old guitar virtuosos on YouTube, and they say they want to quit playing guitar after seeing this kid play. It could be a similar sort of mindset to that. It could be a completely nihilistic and hateful approach where they see something good, beautiful and pretty and they want to destroy it. Or it could be just wanting attention, but not wanting to do the work to get the attention for doing something worthy of having it. So rather than studying really hard and trying to make their own great masterful concerto, they instead invent a load of nonsensical terms and take an emperor's new clothes approach and get to indulge in gibberish and get paid for it.
Yeah. I think all of that's true. I think there's another element as well. I was talking to my friend Legea Rose, who's also a musician, about this. I'm hoping to have her on this show soon. And we realized that there might be a self-esteem element as well sometimes. Because we've both dealt with this academic environment. And it's almost like liking something that nobody else likes, or liking something that most people don't understand, is a source of self-esteem for a lot of people. You might have seen that in the metal world as well. There's a sort of clique of rock and metal as well as classical fans who revel in having something that they're smart enough to know and understand that and nobody else is. And what do you think of that attitude? Like, do you encounter that a lot? Like people turning their noses up at simple music or popular music, punk rock and things like that don't have that same level of complexity. And what do you think of that attitude?
Yeah, I completely agree. That's definitely going to be a factor in it as well. People often choose an identity for themselves that doesn't involve or avoid putting work into their personality or into their skills. People, rather than trying to be good at something, they'll talk a certain way or wear certain clothes, and they'll build their personality around that. And with music, you see it as well. Definitely, I don't enjoy punk rock. I find it really boring. If somebody else generally enjoys it, that's great for them.
Yeah, and as someone who's interested in both classical and metal music, obviously talking about these academics, there's the ones we've talked about, the avant-garde electroacoustic ones, and then there's the traditional classical academics and classical fans who will turn their noses up at anything popular, anything that lacks that complexity. And I've even encountered this in the objectivist world, where certain people will say classical music's like the only music that has value, and that kind of shocks me. So as someone who's in both of those worlds, do you think that the value of classical music and the value of rock and metal is equivalent, or is there an important difference in the kind of value you can get from one versus the other?
Yes and no. So I think there's two main parts to this. One is that we can objectively say that there are very highly skilled musicians in the rock and metal world, and people who aren't so. But even if you enjoy the greatest virtuoso violinists, you have to be able to look at Yngwie Malmsteen or Steve Vai play and say, okay, I might not enjoy what these guys do, but they can do it really well. To say that there's no value in lyrical music is basically the same thing as saying there's no value in poetry. You can say that you don't enjoy it, and that's perfectly valid. So somebody could say, I love classical music, I don't like rock or metal music, but to say that there's no value in it is a completely different thing to say. But I can see that maybe people get the two things confused. And the other aspect is a lot of people say that they don't see the value in rock music, but what they really mean is they don't like the timbre of an electric guitar, which again is a completely fair perspective to have. But quite often with music, people really struggle to express what they actually mean accurately. For example, confusing I don't enjoy the timbre of this instrument with this music has no value. So people struggle with that quite a lot. And then there are some aspects to classical music we don't tend to see in rock and metal very much. For example, 99% of rock and metal music is just pure melody and accompaniment. Maybe you've got two voices at when we talk from like a music theory level, two voices at the absolute most. So from a voice leading perspective, harmonically, it's very, very simple. Even complex virtuoso guitar players will be playing melody and accompaniment. Whereas with classical music, you will have more four-part voice leading. The voice leading is going to be a lot stricter, and that's going to create a very rich, harmonious effect, which we don't tend to see in rock and metal music. People who enjoy classical music and they value it very highly are probably, I want to say, obsessing over that element of music, but it's maybe not the right word, focusing on that element of the music and saying that it doesn't exist in this element of this kind of rich harmony, this rich voice leading doesn't exist in other forms of music, therefore that music is worthless. So I think those are probably where the perspectives are coming from. I think another part of that is also the barrier to entry for good classical music is a lot higher than it is for good rock music. Writing a good string quartet or a good orchestral piece is, I think, a lot harder than writing a good rock song. But that doesn't mean that the good rock song is not a good rock song.
Yeah, and the multi-voicing part you're describing with classical music is probably where a lot of that sense of beauty that we feel with a well-written classical piece comes
Oh,
from.
definitely.
Counterpoint and dynamism. Do you think that rock and metal can achieve that too? And I'm thinking of things like post-reunion Iron Maiden, like post-2000 Brave New World Iron Maiden, where they had three guitars as well as vocals, or bands like Rush or Dream Theater, where there's a lot more complexity going on in the structure. Do you think metal can achieve that kind of complexity in terms of tone and timbre?
Definitely, but it needs to be approached very carefully in order to create the effect. So you do need multiple musicians. You can't create that effect on the guitar just by yourself. I've tried, and I don't have enough fingers on my hands for it. But as soon as you have multiple guitar players and a keyboard player, you can achieve that. It will give the music a much more depth and richness to it. So it's definitely possible. It's possibly a niche for somebody out there to give something like that a go. But it would be stylistically very, very different to what exists in the genre. So whether or not you'd be able to develop a fan base around that would be an interesting question.
Yeah, and there's been interesting experiments, not just the sort of bands I mentioned, but also bands who fuse classical with rock. I'm thinking of Nightwish is the archetypal example of that, but there's a lot of bands in that space who combine the two and produce something that has that depth and richness as well. So when you're composing, whether it's classical or rock, or both perhaps, what is your approach to composition? Are you starting with an idea? Are you starting with a tune? Like, what's your goal and what's your process as a composer?
With rock stuff, it tends to be a bit more improvised. So I'll be noodling around on my guitar, I'll come up with a riff or a melody or idea, and then I'm going to use that for building the rest of the instruments around it, building out a structure and a form around that, getting the full piece together. With the classical stuff I tend to write, it tends to be a lot more almost mathematical, because I'm considering all the voice leading constraints that are going on while I'm writing it as well. So this note here and this note here, and now because this note's here, these two notes now have a set of constraints on them, and the two notes after it have another set of constraints on them, and all of these constraints have to be satisfied simultaneously. So I have a physics background, so approaching it that way really appeals to the science part of my brain, because it's just a very tricky, interconnected problem. And then I'm going to take the idea, flesh it out, and then again build a structure around it that way.
So that raised an interesting thought in my head, because I've watched a lot of videos from accounts like 12 Tone on YouTube, analyzing the structure of rock songs in particular from a technical standpoint, sort of musical notation standpoint. It seems to me that composing in that way, especially if you're composing a rock song, because what a lot of these analysts do, well, they'll say, look, the reason this song works is because of this modulation that's followed by this voicing, and they'll do it like with Guns N' Roses and Alice Cooper and stuff like that. And you'll get the impression that these are really intricately composed songs, but probably the reality is a bunch of guys just sat in a room and, like you say, noodled around and found something that sounded good. So it's probably not the compositional process that most artists are going through, although it might be with bands like Queen and Muse, but not with the less technical bands, not so much. Do you think that kind of mathematical approach to composing music risks losing the flexibility that's necessary to express an emotional idea?
Yes and no. So it's definitely possible to get lost in the maths and start to do it purely for the maths in one way. And I think when you get to modern theoretical approaches to music, like set theory, that's what's happened, which is another reason probably why a lot of modern classical music sounds awful. It's because people are saying, rather than saying, how do I create a nice piece of music, which was what music theory did for the last 2,000 years, they said, instead say, well, I've got these notes available and I could arrange them like this, or use a formula to arrange them like this. And therefore, because I've used this formula, this is now nice music, which is not the case. Yeah, so I think the flexibility can be lost, but I think ultimately when it comes down to it, the point of music theory is to give you a mathematical way to describe emotion. So if you've studied it to enough level and you can kind of sit back and think about it, then it should always be an aid rather than a hindrance.
Yeah, so I think it's making a broader point about learning there, isn't it? Which applies to learning guitar or anything as well. Like if you can subconsciously integrate the abstract idea, you can do it. You trust your subconscious to produce the product as well. The same thing's true of writing. If you automate those principles, you can produce the thing without really needing to consciously think about it. Which leads us on to your work as a guitar teacher and guitar practice theorist. Because I know you've got your book about guitar practice and what that can teach us about creativity. Could you talk a bit about your approach to practice and learning and the principles at play in that book?
Yeah, so I completely agree with what you just said. That's one of the things I outline in the book about when it comes to creativity is that most people don't master a particular idea sufficiently to have it completely automated in their subconscious, which then gives them the chance to be creative. So if you're struggling to change from a G chord to a D chord and you sit and have to think about it, you'll never be able to write a creative chord progression because your brain is struggling to move your fingers and it doesn't have the spare space to think about the music. My approach to teaching guitar was always to break things down to a very fundamental level where possible. Well, it's always possible to break it down to a fundamental level. Ultimately, when you're playing a guitar, your fingers are touching a string and they're moving across the strings. So it's just a series of mechanical movements. So every single thing that's ever done and ever has been done and ever will be done on a guitar can be broken down into a set of movements. If your student is struggling with something, it means that they're struggling to make a particular set of movements. So you can then isolate the thing that they're struggling with. You can train them on it at a slower tempo so they can do it accurately, slowly get them to improve with enough repetitions, and then reintegrate it back into the bigger picture. Now, whenever a student was struggling with something and I've sufficiently broken it down for them, I'd always say to them, have you done it 1,000 times yet? And they'd say no, and say, okay, that's why you're struggling.
Yeah, my guitar teacher's always telling me, like, half-hourly practice every day at least. Have that repetition, have that bedding in. I also find when I'm learning different subjects that I can integrate between different things I've learned because I'm curious about a wide range of topics. So just a completely different example. I found learning about economics easier because of my interest in railways and history. And I already had concretes from those topics that served as examples for the principles in economics. You said you studied physics and then went to music. And I can already see a connection there because I actually did the same thing. I did physics at school at A level and then did music at HND and master's level. And I know an integration I made there, but I'm curious, did you find any of the principles that you learned either about physics itself or about learning in general, about the world in general, as a student of physics, helped you with your music learning and approach to music as well?
I think what I found most useful was the general approach just to figuring things out. So you get a set of problem in physics and you've got to figure out how this thing's working, what equations apply to it, what equations don't apply to it. My master's project was looking at a star that pulsates in space, and if you imagine a balloon being inflated and deflated, the star is doing that. So I got some satellite data of it and analysed images and recreated some graphs and looked at the equations that were governing how the star was working. So there's a lot of just sitting down and figuring things out. When it came to teaching, it was a lot of sitting down and figuring out, okay, this person's stuck with this thing. I can do this thing. They can't. What is it I've done that they've not done that could get them to be able to do this thing? Are they misunderstanding something? Have they misidentified something conceptually? Are their fingers doing something they shouldn't be? How can I train their fingers to be able to automate this little kind of process or movement that I'm trying to get them to do? The general approach to sitting down and figuring something out, I think, was probably the main crossover thing I took.
Yeah, for me, I found that acoustics was the big crossover. Like my understanding of how gases behave in a space and things like that really helped me understand acoustics, which a lot of my classmates were struggling with, the principles of how sound reflects off a wall and things like that. And my physics studies really helped me understand that. When you talked about the pulsar research and you're saying about how the equations that govern the star's behavior, and of course, it's not really that the equations govern the star's behavior, it's more that the equations are our means of understanding the laws of physics that govern the star's behavior. And I think the same thing's true of music and harmony in a sense, isn't it? Is that musical notation and theory that we were talking about earlier is our way of understanding the acoustics of music, the relationships between the frequencies of notes and that kind of thing, which gives an objectivity to music. There's an objective way of knowing if something's harmonic or not. So what do you think is the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity as far as music taste is concerned? Like you said earlier, that if somebody likes punk rock, that's fair enough, and I would broadly agree with that because I can see the value in punk rock. But is there music that is objectively bad, especially, and not just in terms of whether it's subjectively harmonic or not, but in terms of things like the ideas it expresses, complexity, quality? Do you think that can be judged objectively?
Is some music objectively better than others? Like your average string quartet is going to have voicing and complexity far greater than the greatest rock guitar piece. The greatest rock guitar solo is going to have more, it's going to be objectively more technically advanced than a simple string quartet. A lot of music is just garbage, and I think people are afraid to say that. Some music expresses just horrible nihilistic ideas about hating everything, and okay, maybe if you've had a very tough time in your life, that helps you get through it, but if you're listening to that every day, I don't think it's going to be terribly good for you. The same way as continuously exposing yourself to any sort of bad idea isn't going to be good for you in whatever medium you do it in, whether it's conversations you're having, people you're talking to, or even just eating garbage food every day. Yeah, some music is definitely worse than others. How you measure that can be done through any of the elements of music. The different elements of music include a form, rhythm, structure, melody, harmony, timbre, and there's probably a couple others I'm forgetting as well.
Also, the themes and ideas expressed
Mm.
is definitely a component, I'd say.
So you can look across any of those kind of dimensions of music, and then you can objectively compare music, two pieces of music, and say, okay, this one's got more complexity in this area, this one's got more complexity in this area. But again, complexity doesn't necessarily mean it's good. That's good. That's taking a very rationalizing approach to music. But you can say, when complexity is properly applied, music is going to sound good. This is what I'm trying to get out there. But applying complexity for the sake of it will not make music sound good.
Exactly, yeah. You mentioned how nihilistic music may have a role when somebody's suffering or going through a dark time. And I used to think that. I used to think that like listening to System of a Down be angry all the time was helping me deal with hard times in life. But I think in retrospect it was actually perpetuating that. It was actually drawing out my suffering because I was living in this sort of almost echo chamber of negativity. And so my musical journey was kind of going from that to going towards genres and style and artists within genres that were more reinforcing of a positive worldview, like the ones I mentioned earlier. I'm curious, I'll finish up by asking, what's been your musical journey, both as a fan and as a musician, in terms of how music has contributed to your life and how that's changed over the years?
Oh, okay, that's a nice question. I think my earliest musical memory is hearing, what was it? I think it was Stuck in the Middle with You. I can't remember who it was by. When I was at school, the primary school, there was a tape recorder with some tapes we could listen to in the break. Back in the days before everyone had an iPhone, so there'd be a little tape player and some headphones, and you could listen to it if you wanted to. And my parents didn't really listen to music very much. I wasn't exposed to it very much as a kid. Go to secondary school, high school for Americans watching, and fell in with a group of kids there that were listening to dance music on the radio. So I was like, okay, I'll listen to dance music on the radio as well to fit in. And it sounded awful. I didn't understand why they enjoyed listening to it. I found myself trying to enjoy listening to this kind of music, and it didn't really work. I ended up taking guitar lessons, and my guitar teacher gives me an Yngwie Malmsteen CD and a Joe Satriani CD. And I'm like, wow, this is amazing. This is what music should be like. So from there, it's very much getting into instrumental rock music and different rock and metal bands, finding bands like Iron Maiden, Metallica, and really enjoying those for a decade or so. And then after that, slowly getting more into classical music. I found that more challenging to get into because there's such an enormous spectrum of it. There's stuff that's just garbage, and there's stuff which I don't like, and kind of sifting through that to find the things I do like, and then being able to find more of the things I like based on that. Then getting really into, for example, Scoletti's piano sonatas, Beethoven's piano sonatas, Wagner's operas, Puccini's operas as well. Really enjoying those at the moment. So that's kind of been my musical journey so far, and hopefully find some other cool stuff to listen to the next few decades as well.
I've heard it said that classical music was basically just metal before the technology existed to do metal. Like a lot of it, so if you listen to something like Tannhauser from Wagner or some of Beethoven's concertos and stuff like that, the power of that music is really quite similar in some respects to a lot of heavy metal. Do you have any parting thoughts, and where can people find you if they're interested in reading your work or following you on socials or anything like that?
My website is samrussell.co.uk. If you go on Kickstarter and look for Sam Russell String Quartet, you'll be able to find that and help me bring those to life. And as my final thoughts, I guess, I hope whoever's watching this can find my music they enjoy and give it a chance, even if it's not mine. And if you're, sometimes people struggle to get into music, I guess, or especially struggle to get into classical music. And my final thought would be the best way to do that is to find a best of on YouTube, like top 50 classical songs across the last 1,000 years. Just skip through the ones you don't like until you find something you do, and go on from there.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see all of you on the next episode of the Reason for Living podcast.
Thanks for having me.